A deadly Israeli strike in Rafah that killed scores in a tent camp for the displaced sparks global outrage. Some European countries recognize Palestinian statehood, and a State Department official resigns over the Biden administration's policy on Gaza. This is PBS News Weekly. I'm Nick Schifrin. President Biden on Friday laid out a three-phase proposed deal that would release the remaining Israeli hostages and bring an end to the war, now approaching its 8th month.
And as long as Hamas lives up to its commitments, a temporary ceasefire would become, in the words of the Israeli proposal, the cessation of hostilities permanently.
The proposal comes after Israel expanded its operation in Rafah this week, despite U.S. warnings, and launched an attack that incinerated a tent camp for the displaced. Israeli and U.S. officials say the strike killed 2 Hamas leaders. Israel says that fire was caused by a secondary explosion, possibly because of Hamas weapons cache.
Flames raged through a camp for displaced Palestinians after an Israeli airstrike triggered a massive blaze. Civilians burnt alive and children decapitated. Rescuers rushed to help anyone pulled from the rubble.
We were sitting at the door of the house safely. Suddenly we heard the sound of a missile. We went into the house and we found a girl and a young man who had been cut into pieces.
By sunrise, a charred skeleton of the tent camp is all that remained. Survivors searched the ashes for anything to salvage: a prayer mat, pairs of shoes, or a Quran now destroyed.
We were praying and we were getting our children's beds ready to sleep. Then we heard a very loud noise and fire erupted around us. All the children started screaming and all the nearby rooms were shaking.
The strike hit Gaza's southernmost tip in the Tal al-Sultan neighborhood of Rafah, where thousands of people were sheltering. Israel's military said it occurred outside of the designated humanitarian area, including al-Mawasi, where it had ordered Palestinians to evacuate earlier this month. Israeli officials said the airstrike targeted and killed 2 top Hamas commanders using small warheads that were precision-guided, but the casualties were outstanding. Still, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu pledged to investigate and called the civilian deaths a, quote, tragic mistake.
Despite our best efforts not to harm the non-involved, unfortunately, a technical failure happened last night. We are investigating the case. We will present the conclusions because this is our policy.
Israel has said it's working to eliminate the last remaining Hamas battalions in Rafah, which continues to fire on Israel, as with these missiles it launched at Tel Aviv yesterday. But after the top UN court ordered Israel to halt its Rafah operation last week, its latest strike has triggered a new wave of condemnation. Guido Crosetto is Italy's defense minister.
I have the impression that Israel, with this choice, is spreading hatred, rooting hatred that will involve their children and grandchildren.
French President Emmanuel Macron said he was, quote, outraged by the Israeli strikes, saying these operations must stop. There are no safe areas in Rafah for Palestinian civilians.
To discuss the strike's implication, Amna Nawaz spoke with 2 experts. First, human rights lawyer, activist, and Rutgers University professor Noura Erakat.
Prime Minister Netanyahu says this was a tragic mistake and Israeli officials will investigate. What questions do you want to see answered from that investigation, and do you think you'll get those answers?
What we saw yesterday was the asphyxiation and the burning to death of civilians by the plastic tents that are meant to shelter them. That means that they died in agony. Not only have they been put through a genocide, but even in their death, they are put through indescribable pain and suffering. At this point, we need to be asking questions about the systematic nature of Israel's campaign, which the ICJ has said is plausibly genocide. It is the duty to prevent genocide, not to punish it. After the 3rd ICJ decision, now demanding an immediate ceasefire, why does this operation continue, knowing full well that Hamas cannot be defeated militarily, and that in the outcome, now some 40,000 civilians, 13,000 of them children who have been killed, all the hospitals destroyed, all the universities destroyed, 80% of the population sheltering in the south with no safe zone
Israel says that it's going after the last stronghold of Hamas there. And they also point out Hamas continues to launch missiles into Israel. They continue to hide behind civilians. They also argue that a high death toll serves Hamas. Do you agree with that?
Does anybody actually believe this? The only nuclear power in the Middle East, the 11th most significant military power in the world, 234 days, all the arsenal and impunity, and has not been able to diminish Hamas's military power. Hamas was launching rockets from the very area that Israel said that it had cleared out. American intelligence officials have been telling us from the beginning that Israel cannot defeat Hamas militarily. We, as advocates and as scholars, have been insisting that you cannot defeat Hamas militarily, that it is part of the national and political fabric of Palestinians and that they must be engaged with diplomatically. And yet, even after 234 days, this staggering civilian death toll, Israel nowhere closer to defeating Hamas.
You're mentioning the Hamas, of course, the political wing you say there is part of the political fabric of the Palestinian movement. And I wonder how you think of it from the Jewish perspective when they say this is a force that has called for the end of the Jewish state. How could you ask those 7 million Jews in Israel to find a way to live alongside Hamas? What would you say to that?
This is not an objection from Jewish people around the world. This is an objection from Zionists, be they Jewish Zionists, be they American Zionists, be they Christian Zionists, even if they are Muslim Zionists. They believe in a state that it is exclusively a Jewish demographic majority at the expense of an indigenous population whose land must be taken from them and who must be constantly dispossessed and forced into exile. This equation in and of itself is unsustainable, has been determined as a form of apartheid by human rights legacy organizations like Human Rights Watch, as well as Israeli or human rights organizations like B'Tselem. Apartheid is a regime by which law and policy is used in order to maintain the racial superiority of one group over another. It is only through that thorough dehumanization of the racial other that this genocide is possible, that it has been accepted that babies be burnt alive in plastic tents for their displacement, who are suffering from a famine without access to hospitals and burn units, where we can still be asking the question about whose safety is now at risk and should be prioritized.
That is Noura Erakat, human rights lawyer, associate professor at Rutgers University. Noura, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
We now turn to retired Israeli Colonel Penina Sharvit Baruch. She was a legal advisor to the Israel Defense Forces and is now a senior research fellow at the Israel Institute for National Security Studies. So, Penina, as you heard, Prime Minister Netanyahu said the civilian deaths were a tragic mistake in this strike. It was also a mistake, you'll remember, when the aid convoy from World Central Kitchen was hit, killing 7. And one of the biggest questions people have is why one of the best funded and best trained militaries in the world keeps making these deadly mistakes. What would you say to that?
This is a terrible situation. We are trapped in this war, threatening us in Israel, and we are being attacked from all sides. It feels to us an existential threat. So we know we look strong. We are strong, but the threats are huge. The whole issue of Rafah, why is Rafah important, is because this is the land border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt, and we know that they get from there their supplies, there are tunnels going underneath, a lot of tunnels in Rafah.
But I should point out that it was the ICJ ruling just last week that ordered Israel to halt its military offensive in Rafah, as you're pointing out, which is a critical point there. So how is this military strike in Rafah not in violation of that order?
Well, the order didn't say that Israel must halt its operations in Gaza. What the order said, and I'll quote it, is that Israel must halt its military offensive and any other action in Rafah which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part. This is limited to what is covered by the Genocide Convention. Israel is not carrying out a genocide.
I'm reading the same text you are. It says the state of Israel shall immediately halt its military offensive, as you just read there, that could bring about physical destruction in whole or in part. 45 civilians were killed. That is physical destruction in whole or in part, is it not?
Yes, but genocide has the element of intent. And the idea here was that Israel has to do what it can to avoid destruction and indeed, what happened here is a tragedy, but again, what has to be checked is whether how did it happen? Israel, at least according to what the initial explanation is, that it was using accurate ammunition, and perhaps there was something that, some fire that broke out. Civilians get killed. It is terrible, it is tragic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there is an intention. It definitely doesn't mean that there's a genocidal intention.
Pnina, as you've heard, some will argue that, look, Hamas is inseparable from the Palestinian national movement that sprang from oppression, from a lack of freedom. Those are conditions that persist for Palestinians today, and that killing every last fighter of Hamas right now won't eliminate that. What do you say to that?
I think we have to beat the Hamas, at least the military structure of the Hamas. If the Hamas continues to control the Gaza Strip, that means not only that Israel lost the war, and this is very dangerous because Iran is looking at other enemies. It is really dangerous for Israel, but it also means that there will be no prospects of peace. Hamas is opposed to peace.
That is retired Israeli Colonel Pnina Shavit Baruch, now with the Israel Institute for National Security Studies. Pnina, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The UN says famine looms in Gaza, and since Israel launched its ground operation in Rafah 3 weeks ago, only about 1,000 humanitarian aid trucks have reached southern Gaza, compared to the 500 per day that are needed. And this week, U.S. aid administrator Samantha Power referred to, quote, the catastrophic consequences of Israel's operation in Rafah on Gaza's humanitarian crisis. At the same time, the U.S. paused aid deliveries across its $320 million military-built pier after it was damaged by rough seas. To discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza and U.S. policy toward Israel, I spoke with Ambassador David Satterfield, a State Department senior advisor who was, until recently, the U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues. Israel said the fire that killed so many in a tent camp on Sunday was caused by a secondary explosion. Is this exactly the kind of incident that you were warning Israel about when you were warning it against a major operation in Rafah?
We were concerned in advance of the Rafah operation about two things. First, the effect of displacement, again, because these people have been multiply displaced, of a significant civilian population. That displacement has in fact occurred. Our second concern was about the physical impact of an operation, however confined, on the ability to move humanitarian assistance from Kerem Shalom, from Rafah Terminal, into Gaza proper. And there we have had significant challenges since the operation began.
When it comes to the threshold of punishing Israel for a Rafah operation that the U.S. has warned against, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, said this last week.
One of you asked me the last time I was standing at this podium, how are you going to judge this? And I said that there's no mathematical formula. What we're going to be looking at is whether there is a lot of death and destruction from this operation or if it is more precise and proportional. And we will see that unfold.
Does the incineration of so many people in that tent camp on Sunday match, quote, a lot of death and destruction?
We continue to regard what is happening on the ground in Rafah as a limited operation in terms of its scope, but the effect, heartbreaking as it is, to see the images of civilians, women and children in particular, suffering in this, we are not in a position to make an independent judgment on what was responsible, who was responsible for that incident.
But even if you don't know exactly who or what was responsible, the kind of images we saw and the kind of numbers we saw from the Sunday incident, is this not exactly what the U.S. was concerned about?
We are concerned about maximum efforts being undertaken by Israel to protect as much as possible in this conflict which Hamas brought about, the ability of civilians to live in as much security as possible. This is a very tough fight. We understand that. We understand the need to address the Hamas battalions that remain in Rafah, but the manner of addressal has to be done as carefully as possible.
Again, did you warn the Israelis that this kind of displacement would happen? And have they prepared enough for it?
We expressed two primary concerns. One was that no matter how precise an operation was in terms of its intent or actual scope, the effect on a multiply displaced population would be a much larger exit from Rafah than Israel itself had instructed or planned for. And in fact, we've seen exactly that take place. Our second concern is that such a displacement would need to have adequate preparation in terms of shelter, in terms of feeding, sanitation, medical support for those moving. We did not believe prior to the operation beginning that such a credible executable plan existed. We do not see adequate support for that population that moved on the ground today.
Zooming out, do you think Hamas can be defeated with a military operation?
The defeat of Hamas requires two things. It does require military action. Hamas has a terrorist army that started out at some 30,000 persons. Only a portion of those numbers have been taken off the battlefield. Yes, military action is required, but political action is also required. You cannot defeat an idea without a counter idea. And the administration has been very clear. We believe Israel must outline, and outline clearly, a commitment to an alternate political vision, to an alternate horizon than Hamas's grim Islamist extremist vision. And that is a credible pathway to a two-state resolution.
The U.S. approach to Netanyahu has been to offer him a choice. You can either go down the current road of fighting perhaps endlessly in Gaza, or you can take the so-called high road, the project that the U.S. has been working on, not only that envisions a future of Gaza, but also perhaps normalization with Saudi Arabia. What happens if Netanyahu does not take the choice that the U.S. is pushing for?
Nick, I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals, but I will say there is an opportunity here for the region, for Israel, for Palestinians to move forward in a different way, in a more positive direction than in the past. It's essential here that Gaza not return to what it was before October 7th, that the people of Gaza, those 2.2 million, not be held in rigid control by a terrorist group. They, the Palestinians, deserve more, and all of us are working to try to hold out the prospect of more and better for them.
Ambassador David Satterfield, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick.
And this week, Stacey Gilbert, a career State Department official, quit over the U.S.'s policy toward Israel. I spoke to her about her decision. Why have you chosen to resign rather than fight for policy within the State Department?
This follows a lot of frustration about the policy, but especially seeing what's happening in Gaza. When this national security memo directive came out in early February, which directed the State Department and Department of Defense to write a report to Congress assessing countries on two things: their ability to adhere to international humanitarian law, also known as the law of war or the Geneva Conventions, and whether they facilitate and not block humanitarian assistance. I've worked in government for a long time. I'm not one who relishes getting tasked with more reports, but I thought this is a report that actually could have some impact. I was mostly focused on humanitarian assistance. So when the report came out on May 10th and I read the conclusion, especially the conclusion on that Israel was not blocking humanitarian assistance, I decided I would resign because that was absolutely not the opinion of subject matter experts in the State Department, USAID, the humanitarian community, organizations that are working in Gaza.
And those subject matter experts included you, because you were participating in the report. Let me bring it up. Here's the quote from the State Department report that you referenced. "We do not currently assess that the Israeli government is prohibiting or otherwise restricting the transport or delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance within the meaning of Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act." That's a reference to a law about humanitarian assistance. Now, as you say, that was not the opinion of you, your other colleagues, some of your other colleagues in the State Department and USAID, and you write this quote: "There is abundant evidence showing Israel is responsible for blocking aid. To deny this is absurd and shameful." What is your evidence for that?
There are databases for any day. You could get quantifiable data about how many trucks are backed up at the border, how many tons of flour have not been allowed in. And sometimes things get in, but most often things are delayed, blocked. There are other bureaucratic impediments to delivering that aid. We have the data. It is known. The organizations working on the ground in Gaza have sent numerous reports detailing those obstacles. So to look at that information and assess that Israel is not blocking aid is ludicrous.
The report does criticize Israel for, quote, not fully cooperating with U.S. efforts to maximize aid delivery, but it goes on to point out that Hamas is embedded in the civilian population and appropriated aid for military purposes. And it points out that Israel substantially increased aid in early to mid-April as the report was being released. So doesn't that mean that Israel was not blocking aid at the time the report was released?
Israel has been blocking aid throughout this, and it's like turning on and off a spigot. Sometimes aid comes in, often it gets turned off, and it is simply not enough to address the needs in Gaza. It hasn't been. That's why there is a famine. Famine is not...
the UN has not declared a famine. They've said famine is looming. The World Food Program, the executive director, has declared famine in northern Gaza.
The conditions for famine are there, widespread. It is severe malnutrition, and the remedy for that is certainly more food. The assistance that Israel allows in has been minimal. It has been turned on, turned off, and it's not just assistance going in. It's things like visas for aid workers. It's a range of obstacles they've posed.
We should say that Israel has said it doesn't block aid, and it actually has blamed the UN, as you know, for the ability or inability, as Israel has argued, in order to deliver that aid. And you accused officials in the United States State Department of denying the facts. That's a quote from your letter. And here's what Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel said today.
We stand by the National Security Memorandum 20 report. We are not an administration or a department that twists the facts, and allegations that we have are unfounded.
Did the State Department twist the facts?
They did. Again, the subject matter experts are in consensus on this, that Israel has blocked humanitarian assistance. In many ways. The
report that you drafted, that you saw, the version of the report that you saw was changed, you told me earlier today, by undersecretary level, kind of number 3 level underneath the Secretary of State. Isn't that normal, though? Isn't it normal for people like you to draft things and then the ultimate decision goes to higher-level people, including the Secretary?
What typically happens is the subject matter experts draft the report, and it goes through a clearance process. That's very common. In this case, subject matter experts were removed from the report, and it was drafted at a higher level. That's not to say there aren't other constraints that the humanitarian aid organizations face, but I'm also resigning in part to speak up for them.
Stacy Gilbert, former senior civil military advisor in the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And this week, 3 European countries, Spain, Norway, and Ireland, formally recognized a Palestinian state. It's a mostly symbolic move designed to isolate Israel diplomatically. Here's what the country's leaders had to say.
Norway recognizes the state of Palestine effective from tomorrow. We do that because it's the right thing to do, but even more importantly, because it's the right time to do it. For many years, we and so many other countries were expecting to recognize at the end of a peace process where everything else was in place. But then a few years ago, we realized that we actually needed to think outside the box and maybe recognize at the time when it would give a strong impulse, a strong signal into a process. And since then, we have been looking for that moment.
The intention of several European countries to recognize a Palestinian state is a reward for terrorism. This evil must not be given a country. This will be a terrorist state. It will try to repeatedly carry out the massacre of October 7th, and we will not agree to that. A reward for terrorism will not bring peace, and it will not stop us from defeating Hamas either.
The international community, including the European Union, have been talking about support for the two-state solution based on the 1967 borders for decades. But we are no nearer to actually getting to that desired end state. And we firmly believe that without changing our approach, we will never get there. Some have framed our decision as a move, our decision to recognize the state of Palestine as a move to impose an outcome on the parties, or as somehow a reward for terror. Nothing could be further from the truth. We have recognized both the state of Israel and the state of Palestine precisely because we want to see a future of normalized relations between the two peoples.
Our goal is to recognize the state of Palestine tomorrow and make every possible effort to achieve a permanent ceasefire as soon as possible, and ultimately to reach that definitive peace. And I want to remind you that precautionary measures, like all decisions of the International Court of Justice, are mandatory for all parties. And that is, Israel must stop its offensive in Rafah. In the same way and with the same intensity, we condemn the rocket launches by Hamas towards Israel.
Recognition means a lot for us. It's the most important thing that anybody can do for the Palestinian people is to recognize them as independent, worthwhile people in this region that can contribute to its peaceful living for all its children and populations. So it's a great deal for us.
For all of us at PBS News Weekly, thanks so much for watching.